The drone captured something it was never supposed to see. A massive nest, deep in the Idaho wilderness, built from bent trees and branches woven like a giant's shelter. At first, it looked like an abandoned survival camp. But the smell was wrong. The prints inside were too big. And that's when everything changed. For the next 3 days, 2 men were hunted. At night came the knocks, the rocks thrown into camp, the heavy footsteps pacing just out of sight. And then, the drone itself was struck out of the sky. They thought they were just documenting elk. Instead, they walked into something intelligent, territorial, and furious that they had found its home. If the creature was warning them to leave, why did it wait until the 3rd day to close in? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. I've been a wildlife photographer for over 12 years, specializing in North American large mammals. But the summer of 2017 marked my first serious attempt at incorporating drone footage into my work. The technology had finally reached a point where the image quality and flight stability made it worth lugging the extra gear into the backcountry. My friend Kyle, a forestry technician who knew the Idaho Panhandle National Forests better than anyone I'd met, agreed to join me on what we planned as a 10-day expedition to document elk behavior. Before hunting season began, we loaded my 4-wheel drive truck on August 15th, the bed packed with our camping gear, my photography equipment, and the new drone kit I'd spent months saving for. Kyle tossed his well-worn forestry pack on top, complete with his compass, topographical maps, and the practical tools that had served him through countless surveys of these mountains. You really think that flying toy of yours is going to get you anything better than your regular camera setup? Kyle asked as we pulled onto Highway 95 heading north. He'd been skeptical of the drone idea since I'd first mentioned it, but I knew his doubts came from a place of experience rather than criticism. It's about perspective, I explained, keeping my eyes on the winding road, getting above the canopy, following herds without disturbing them. Plus, the thermal imaging attachment could be a game changer for tracking movement patterns at dawn and dusk. Kyle grunted, pulling out one of his maps to review our planned route. Just remember, we're dealing with some serious elevation changes. Up there, battery life's going to be your enemy, and recovery's not exactly easy if you crash in that timber. He had a point. The region we were heading into was characterized by steep ridgelines and valleys thick with lodgepole pine and western red cedar. Some of the slopes reached 45-degree angles, making ground travel challenging enough without worrying about retrieving a downed drone. We spent that first afternoon setting up our base camp in a small clearing about 12 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. The location gave us access to 3 different drainages where elk herds had been spotted during recent wildlife surveys. The August heat had pushed many of them higher up the ridges, seeking cooler air and better grazing. As we finished securing our tent, Kyle pointed out fresh elk droppings and some torn bark on nearby trees, signs that we'd chosen our spot well. The late summer sun filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor, and the only sounds were the soft whisper of wind through the treetops and the occasional call of a Clark's nutcracker. I've got a good feeling about this drainage, I said, unpacking my camera gear. The terrain funnels right down to that meadow we passed about a mile back. Perfect spot for morning activity. Kyle checked his watch and compass, making notes in his field journal. Weather reports. Holding steady for the next few days. Clear skies, light winds from the northwest. Should be ideal for your flying camera. He paused, scanning the ridgeline visible through a break in the trees. Just keep in mind we're pretty exposed up here if a storm rolls in unexpectedly. These mountains have their own weather patterns. I nodded, already planning my first drone flight for sunrise. The fading daylight painted the surrounding peaks in deep purple and gold, and as darkness settled over our camp, the vastness of the wilderness around us became more apparent. We were alone out here, just two friends with different perspectives on the same landscape, unaware that this trip would challenge everything we thought we knew about these ancient forests. That first evening, as we settled into our camp, the isolation of our chosen spot really started to sink in. The drainage we'd selected was nestled between two steep ridges, with our tent positioned on one of the few relatively flat areas we could find. The nearest road was 12 miles away, and the closest town was a good 3-hour drive, assuming. The Forest Service roads were in decent condition. Cell service is completely dead up here, Kyle noted, checking his phone before stowing it in his pack. Radio check? He pulled out his Forestry Service radio, and we confirmed it was still picking up the repeater station, though the signal was weak. I spent the remaining daylight assembling my drone and running through my pre-flight checklist. The DJI Phantom 4 Pro wasn't the newest model on the market, but its reliability and image quality made it perfect for wildlife documentation. I'd added a custom thermal imaging attachment that had cost nearly as much as the drone itself. Mind walking me through your background again? Kyle asked as he organized his survey gear. I know you've been shooting wildlife for years, but what got you started? I secured the drone's propellers while explaining. Started with landscape photography in college, but I quickly realized I was more interested in capturing animal behavior. Spent 5 years building my portfolio, everything from desert bighorns in Nevada to wolves in Yellowstone. The drone is just the next step. Getting those overhead perspectives could revolutionize how we document herd movements. Kyle nodded, his expertise as a forestry technician evident in how he analyzed our surroundings. These drainages are perfect for that. Elk use them like highways, especially during season changes. Just remember that thermal imaging can be tricky with the canopy cover. The next morning, I was up before dawn, preparing for my first flight. The air was crisp with just enough light to safely operate. Kyle helped me find a clear launch area, and soon the drone was humming steadily at 400 feet, its camera capturing the landscape below. The footage was better than I'd hoped. The drone's perspective revealed game trails I hadn't noticed from the ground, winding through the timber like threads in a tapestry. The meadows showed up clearly, their dew-covered grass gleaming in the early light. I could make out several wallows and what appeared to be fresh elk beds near the tree line. This is incredible, I said, keeping my eyes on the controller's screen. Look at how the herds have been moving through here. I pointed out several distinct trails that converged. Near a natural spring, Kyle studied the live feed with professional interest. Those patterns match up with our survey data. The thermal imaging picking up anything. I switched to the thermal camera, and the screen transformed into a heat map of the forest below. Nothing large enough to be elk right now, but this will be perfect for dawn and dusk monitoring. We spent the next hour documenting the surrounding terrain. The drone's battery life allowed for 3 separate flights, each one revealing new aspects of the landscape. I was particularly interested in a series of clearings that stepped up the northern ridge, perfect spots for elk to graze while maintaining clear sightlines. You know, Kyle said as I brought the drone in for its final landing, I've hiked these ridges dozens of times, but seeing them from above really changes your perspective. Makes you realize how vast and interconnected everything is up here. I carefully packed away the drone, pleased with the morning's work, but aware that we were just getting started. The isolation that had felt so pronounced the night before now seemed like an advantage. We had this entire drainage to ourselves, with no other humans for miles to disturb the wildlife we hoped to document. I checked my drone's battery level, 78% before launching it from our makeshift landing zone, a relatively flat boulder near camp. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, creating perfect conditions for spotting wildlife movement. My DJI Phantom 4 hummed to life, its white frame quickly becoming a small speck against the darkening Idaho sky. How much More elk footage do you need? Kyle asked, stirring a pot of instant coffee over our camp stove. We've got hours of them already. Just want to check that western ridge before we lose the light, I replied, eyes fixed on my controller's screen. There's a natural funnel point where two game trails converge. Could be good for morning activity. The drone's camera fed crisp 4K footage to my display as I guided it along the ridgeline. Dense stands of lodgepole pine gave way to occasional clearings, their edges marked by fallen timber and new growth. About 400 yards from camp, something caught my eye, an unusual dark mass tucked into a shallow ravine. Hold up, I muttered, bringing the drone to a hover. Kyle, come look at this. Kyle set down his coffee and peered over my shoulder at the screen. I adjusted the camera angle, trying to get a better view of what looked like a dome-shaped structure, maybe 15 feet across. Young saplings had been bent and woven together, forming an arch that rose perhaps 8 feet at its apex. Probably an old hunter's shelter, Kyle suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Or maybe those trees got taken down in that big storm system last spring. I switched to the drone's zoom lens, capturing detailed footage of the structure. The weaving pattern seemed too intricate for storm damage, and the materials too fresh for an abandoned shelter. Some of the branches still had green leaves attached. I don't know, I said, banking the drone around for another pass. Look at how those saplings are bent. They're not broken. They're actually curved and tied together. That takes some serious force, Kyle shrugged. Bears can do some weird stuff to young trees when they're marking territory. Remember those twisted aspens we found last year? But this was different. The construction showed clear purpose and entrance. Way faced downhill, and the whole thing was partially concealed by surrounding vegetation. I saved the GPS coordinates and captured several more minutes of footage from different angles. We should check it out tomorrow, I suggested, bringing the drone back toward camp as the battery warning flashed. Aaron, Kyle's tone carried that familiar note of exasperation. We came here to document elk patterns, remember? Not chase down every weird thing we spot in the woods. He was right, of course. We had limited time and specific goals for this trip. But as I reviewed the footage that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something significant. The structure's architecture seemed too deliberate, too complex for any natural explanation I could think of. Look, if it's on our way to the North Meadow tomorrow, we can take a quick look, Kyle finally conceded, probably more to quiet my obsessing than out of genuine interest. But we're not burning half a day bushwhacking through that mess just to find some old debris pile. I nodded, but my mind was already mapping the route we'd need to take. The image of those carefully bent saplings kept drawing my attention back to the footage, each viewing revealing new details that didn't quite fit with Kyle's rational explanations. There was something about that structure that felt intentional, almost engineered, and it pulled at my curiosity like a splinter I couldn't ignore. Marked the coordinates from the drone footage on my GPS and showed Kyle the rough route I'd planned to the structure. Though he'd been skeptical at first, his forestry background made him curious about any unusual formations in these woods. It's about 2 miles as the crow flies, I said, shouldering my pack with water and emergency gear. But looking at the terrain, we're probably talking closer to 3 with all the elevation changes. The August heat pressed down on us as we started our hike, working our way through dense undergrowth. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs and loose scree, forcing us to pick our steps carefully. Every few hundred yards, I checked the GPS to ensure we were still on track. This grade is brutal, Kyle commented after an hour, wiping sweat from his forehead. Must be at least 45 degrees in some spots. The closer we got to our target, the thicker the vegetation became. Old growth cedars towered overhead, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the afternoon light. The air grew noticeably cooler in these shadows. When we were about 50 yards from the coordinates, I caught the first whiff of something unusual, a heavy, musky odor that reminded me of wet fur mixed with something earthier. Kyle noticed it, too, wrinkling his nose. "Probably just elk," he said, but his voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. The structure came into view through a break in the trees. What had looked interesting but unremarkable from the drone footage now stopped us in our tracks. It wasn't the work of storm damage or some old hunter's shelter. The dome rose about 8 feet high, with saplings methodically woven together in a complex pattern. Some were bent at impossible angles without breaking, creating perfect arches that couldn't have happened naturally. "This is engineered," Kyle said, his professional assessment cutting through our awe. "Look at how these joints are twisted together. This isn't random." We circled the structure slowly. It was roughly circular, maybe 12 feet in diameter, with what appeared to be an entrance facing east. The musky smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. "Should we look inside?" I asked, already pulling out my flashlight. Kyle nodded, though I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder. We ducked through the entrance, having to bend almost double. Our lights revealed a packed dirt floor, but what caught our attention were the depressions in the soil. They looked like someone had been sleeping there. "Those are big," Kyle whispered, holding his hand over one of the impressions for scale. The depression was easily half again, as large as his spread fingers. I was about to take some measurements when we heard branches snapping somewhere in the forest behind us. It wasn't close, but the sound carried clearly in the still air. We shared a look, and without speaking, both knew it was time to leave. The sun was getting low as we made our way back to camp, moving considerably faster than we had on the way in. Neither of us wanted to be in these woods after dark. We maintained a brisk pace, only stopping once to get our bearings and drink some water. "What do you make of it?" I finally asked when our campsite came into view. Kyle took a long time to answer. "I've seen a lot of things in these forests," he said carefully, "but I've never seen construction like that. Whatever made it knew what it was doing." The sun had long since dipped behind the ridgeline when the first knock echoed through the darkness. I was sitting by our dying campfire, documenting the day's findings in my field journal when the sound cut through the evening chorus of crickets, a sharp, wooden crack that seemed to bounce off the surrounding hills. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking over at Kyle, who was organizing his gear for tomorrow. He paused, head tilted. Probably just a dead branch falling. But there was something deliberate about it that made the hair on my neck stand up. I'd spent enough time in these woods to know the random sounds of the forest. This was different, purposeful, almost like a signal. "Could be hunters," Kyle suggested, though his voice carried a note of doubt. "Maybe they're trying to coordinate in the dark." I shook my head. "We haven't seen any sign of other people out here. No tire tracks at the trailhead, no camp smoke, nothing. Besides, hunting season doesn't start for weeks." As if in response to our discussion, another knock rang out, this time from a different direction, maybe 200 yards to the west. It was the same sharp wooden sound. My hand instinctively went to my camera, but I knew trying to record anything in this darkness would be futile. "There's your falling branch theory shot to hell," I muttered. Kyle zipped up his pack with more force than necessary. "Look, I'm not going to jump to crazy conclusions. There are plenty of natural explanations for..." A third knock interrupted. Him, closer this time, and followed by what sounded like heavy movement through the underbrush. The sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves was far too substantial to be any small animal. "That's big," I whispered, reaching for my headlamp. "Mountain lion, maybe?" Kyle shook his head slowly. "Lions don't make wood knocks, Aaron. And they sure don't move that heavy through brush." Despite his earlier skepticism, I could see tension in his shoulders as he scanned the tree line. We sat in silence for several minutes, straining to hear more. The forest had gone unusually quiet, even the crickets had fallen silent. The only sound was the soft popping of our dying fire and our own measured breathing. "I'm turning in," Kyle finally announced, though his voice was quieter than usual. "Whatever it is, we've got good fire, and I've got my sidearm if needed. No point sitting up all night jumping at shadows." I nodded, but my mind was racing. The knocks, the structure we'd found earlier, the strange scent, it was all starting to form a pattern I wasn't sure I was ready to acknowledge. I thought about the drone footage stored on my laptop and wondered what else it might have captured that I hadn't noticed yet. "Yeah, sleep sounds good," I agreed, though I doubted rest would come easily. As I crawled into my tent, another knock echoed through the timber, fainter this time, as if moving away. I heard Kyle shifting in his sleeping bag in the adjacent tent. "Just try to get some sleep," he called over. "We've got a long hike tomorrow." But as I lay there in the darkness, every snapping twig and rustling leaf seemed amplified. The rational part of my brain tried to catalog natural explanations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something intelligent was out there in the darkness, something that wanted us to know it was there. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with half-formed dreams of massive shadows moving through moonlit trees. I woke before dawn, my sleep having been fitful and interrupted by every small sound from the surrounding forest. The memory of that deliberate knock kept replaying in my mind. Kyle was already up, heating water for coffee on our small camp stove. His pragmatic nature showed in how he methodically went about his morning routine, as if last night had been completely ordinary. "Weather's perfect for tracking elk," he said, handing me a steaming cup. "We should head up to that meadow we spotted yesterday." I nodded, grateful for the return to our original mission. The familiar routine of checking my gear, cameras, drone, batteries, memory cards helped ground me. Yet as we hiked up through the morning mist, something felt off. The forest that had seemed so familiar yesterday now held a different quality, like a room where someone had subtly rearranged the furniture. We reached our first observation point just as the sun began burning through the clouds. I set up my primary camera while Kyle glassed the opposite ridge with his binoculars. The morning chorus of birds filled the air, but then suddenly ceased, leaving an unnatural silence that made us both look up. "That's weird," Kyle muttered, scanning the tree line. Everything just went quiet. I felt it too, that creeping sensation of being watched. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. After 15 minutes, the birds gradually resumed their songs, but the moment had left its mark. "I'm going to send up the drone," I said, pulling out my controller. "Maybe we can spot the herd from above." Kyle nodded, but I could tell he was still scanning the trees. I launched the drone, its familiar buzz providing some comfort as it rose above the canopy. The morning light created perfect conditions for filming, and I guided the craft in a slow sweep of the area. Almost without conscious thought, I found myself directing the drone toward the location of the structure we'd discovered yesterday. The screen showed nothing but dense forest and shadow, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The drone's battery warning chirped, forcing me to bring it back. "Any sign of the elk?" Kyle asked as I packed away. "The controller, nothing clear," I replied. "But did you notice how the woods keep going quiet?" "It's like something's moving through," Kyle finished, his usual skepticism wavering slightly. "I've been watching. The silence follows a pattern, moving ridge to ridge." We spent the next 2 hours attempting to focus on our original purpose, documenting the landscape and looking for elk sign. But the forest's strange behavior continued. Periods of normal activity would be interrupted by sudden stillness, as if a switch had been flipped. Each time, I found myself looking over my shoulder, studying the tree line for movement. During our third drone flight, I noticed something odd on the screen, a shadow that seemed to move independently among the trees near the structure site. But when I tried to zoom in, the image became too grainy to make out details. The battery warning forced me to return the drone before I could investigate further. We should move to higher ground, Kyle suggested, clearly trying to maintain our focus on the elk study. Better vantage point up on that ridge. I agreed, but as we packed up our observation gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't just alive with its usual wildlife. It was aware, listening, watching our every move. The woods that had always been my sanctuary now felt like someone else's territory, and we were the intruders. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy as Kyle and I made our way along the stream. We'd spent the morning tracking elk movements, but found only old sign and scattered droppings. The drone footage had shown promising activity in this drainage, so we decided to work our way upstream, checking game trails that intersected with. The water. The stream bed narrowed as we approached a natural crossing point, where decades of animal traffic had worn down the banks into gentle slopes. I was about to step across when Kyle grabbed my shoulder. "Hold up," he said, crouching down near the muddy edge. "Look at this." I knelt beside him, and my breath caught in my throat. There, pressed clearly into the soft earth, was a footprint unlike anything I'd seen before. It was obviously fresh, the edges were still sharp, and water hadn't yet seeped into the deepest parts of the impression. That's not right," I muttered, pulling out my camera with trembling hands. The print was enormous, easily 15 inches long and nearly 7 inches across at the ball of the foot. What struck me most wasn't just the size, but the anatomical detail. 5 distinct toe impressions were visible, with the big toe appearing more human-like than bear-like. Kyle stood up and paced around the area, his forester's training evident in how he systematically searched the ground. "There's more," he called, out, pointing to a series of prints leading away from the crossing. "But this doesn't make sense." "The stride length," I joined in, measuring tape in hand. From heel to heel, the distance between prints measured roughly 6 feet. "No human could make that stride," I said, documenting each measurement in my field journal. "Not at this depth, not in this terrain." "Could be distortion from the mud," Kyle suggested, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Water movement. Maybe some slippage making the prints look bigger than they are." I shook my head, focusing my camera on each print. "Look at the pressure ridges, Kyle. These are pristine impressions. Whatever made these, it was heavy, probably over 500 pounds based on the depth. And it crossed here recently, maybe. Just hours ago." The forest had grown unusually quiet as we studied the tracks. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. Even the stream seemed to whisper rather than babble. I carefully photographed each print from multiple angles, including objects for scale. My hands were steady now, driven by the need to document everything properly. "We should head back," Kyle said, checking his watch. "It's going to be dark in a few hours, and I don't want to be out here after sunset." I nodded but took a few more minutes to complete my documentation. 5 clear prints in total, each one nearly identical in size and depth. I used my GPS to mark the location and made detailed notes about the soil conditions, weather, and time of discovery. As I packed away my camera, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence in the forest felt expectant, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Kyle's usual skepticism seemed shaken by what we'd found. He kept scanning the tree line as we prepared to leave, his hand resting near the bear spray on his belt. "Let's stick to the open areas on our way back," he suggested, and for once, I completely agreed with his caution. The tracks were undeniable evidence of something large and bipedal moving through these woods, something that, by any rational measure, shouldn't exist. I knelt beside Kyle, my breath catching as I registered what he was pointing at. There in the soft mud of the crossing lay a print that made my skin prickle. It was both familiar in its basic humanoid shape and deeply wrong in its proportions. The impression was easily 15 inches long and nearly 7 inches across at its widest point, dimensions that exceeded any human foot I'd ever encountered. That's not right," Kyle muttered, his earlier skepticism wavering. He pulled out his phone and placed it next to the print for scale while I dug my camera. From my packed out, the clarity of the impression was unsettling. 5 distinct toe marks were visible, with what appeared to be dermal ridges preserved in the finer silt. The stride length to the next print was over 4 feet, a spacing that would be impossible for a person to maintain, especially on this uneven terrain. I methodically photographed each print from multiple angles, including overhead shots and close-ups of the toe impressions. Kyle, meanwhile, took measurements with his folding ruler, calling out numbers that I recorded in my field notebook. 15.3 inches length, 6.8 inches at the ball, 5.2 at the heel, he read off, his forester's precision showing through despite his obvious unease. Depth varies from about 1.5 to 2 inches depending on the substrate. The rational part of my mind searched for alternative explanations. Perhaps someone playing an elaborate prank with fake feet, though the remote location made that unlikely. Or maybe some kind of distortion or double print from a bear, though the anatomical details argued against that. We followed the trackway for about 50 yards before it veered off into thicker cover. The spacing remained consistent, suggesting whatever made them was moving at a steady pace, unbothered by the rough ground. As dusk approached, we reluctantly headed back to camp, the weight of our discovery hanging between us. The forest had grown unusually still, that peculiar silence that sometimes descends before sunset. We were about halfway back when the first call echoed across the drainage. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard in these woods, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to combine elements of a whale's song with something almost human. The vocalization lasted several seconds, rising and falling in pitch before fading into the gathering darkness. Kyle and I stopped dead in our tracks, eyes meeting in shared recognition that this was well outside normal forest sounds. Before either of us could speak, a second call answered from much further away, perhaps from beyond the ridge we'd seen the structure on. The two voices created an eerie sense of communication, of intelligent beings coordinating across distance. "That's not a bear," Kyle whispered, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "Or an elk, or anything I know." We quickened our pace back to camp, arriving just as true darkness settled in. The fire we built seemed feeble against the vast darkness of the forest, and neither of us strayed far from its light. The calls continued sporadically through the early evening, always in that same pattern, one voice closer, one more distant. Sleep proved elusive that night. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the undergrowth jolted us awake. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, that primitive instinct that tells you predator eyes are tracking your movements. I kept thinking about those massive prints, about the incredible strength it would take to make those stride lengths, about what kind of creature could produce those haunting calls. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Kyle's sleeping bag rustle. "You awake?" he whispered. "Yeah," I replied softly. "Can't sleep either?" "It feels like," he paused, searching for words, "like we're the ones being observed now. Like we're the subjects of someone else's study." I knew exactly what he meant. The tables had turned. We'd come here to document wildlife, but now something was documenting us. I woke before dawn, determined to get aerial footage of the elk we'd originally come to document. The morning air bit through my jacket as I set up the drone, its rotors humming to life in the gray light. Kyle was still in his sleeping bag, only his watch-checking arm visible as he monitored the time. "You're wasting battery life," he mumbled. But I ignored him. Something about yesterday's tracks and those calls in the night had left me restless. I needed a broader perspective of our surroundings. The drone climbed smoothly, its camera feeding crisp images to my tablet. The forest below appeared peaceful enough, stands of lodgepole pine casting long shadows across the drainage. I guided the craft in a slow sweep along the ridgeline where we'd heard those strange vocalizations. "Hold up," I said, more to myself than Kyle. Something had caught my eye on the screen. I reversed the drone's path, focusing on a section of tree line about 400 yards from our position. Kyle finally emerged from his sleeping bag, drawn by the tension in my voice. "What have you got?" "Elk? I'm not sure." I adjusted the camera angle, trying to get a clearer view. There was movement. The dark shape appeared again, sliding between two massive pines. Even through the drone's high-resolution camera, the figure seemed to resist clear definition, a fluid mass of deep brown or black, moving with deliberate purpose along the forest's edge. It was tall, certainly larger than a human, but the motion blur and partial tree coverage made exact dimensions impossible to determine. "Bear," Kyle said immediately, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty I'd rarely heard from him. "Yes, to be, probably the one making those prints we found." I kept the drone hovering, tracking the shape until it disappeared into thicker cover. "Bears don't move like that," I said quietly. "Look at the playback." I reversed the footage, frame by frame. Even pixelated and indistinct, there was something unsettling about the figure's gait, the way it seemed to flow rather than lumber, its head held high above the brush line. "The resolution's garbage," Kyle pointed out, but he leaned closer to study the screen. "Could be anything at that distance. Wind in the trees, shadows, or a bear moving weird because it spotted the drone." He was right about the quality. The footage was far from conclusive, the kind of thing that would be laughed off online as just another blurry, maybe shot. But watching it again, I couldn't shake the sense of awareness in how the figure moved, the way it used the trees for partial cover, how it seemed to pause and assess before changing direction. "I know what you're thinking," Kyle said, his tone shifting to concern. "But you can't build a case on something this vague. We're out here for elk footage, remember? Real, documented wildlife." I nodded, but my mind was already racing through the pattern of evidence we'd encountered, the woven structure, those massive prints by the stream, the coordinated calls across the valley, and now this shadow that moved with such purpose along the ridgeline. Each piece alone could be explained away, but together, batteries at 25%, Kyle reminded me, tapping his watch. "Better bring it back if you want to save juice for later." I guided the drone home, my thoughts still fixed on that brief glimpse of something that seemed to understand exactly how to stay just beyond clear sight. The footage might be inconclusive, but the intelligence behind that movement, that was something my camera had managed to capture, even if I couldn't quite explain how I knew. The third night descended with an unnatural stillness. Kyle and I had spent the day reviewing the morning's drone footage, arguing over a dark, bulky shape I'd captured moving along the tree line. Even frame by frame, the figure remained frustratingly unclear, just distinct enough to confirm something large had passed through, but too blurred by motion to settle our debate. "Could be anything," Kyle had insisted. "Probably a bear." But bears don't typically shadow camps or respond to wood. Knocks with calculated precision. We built our fire higher than usual that evening, neither of us willing to admit why. The flames cast dancing shadows against the surrounding pines, and I caught myself studying every movement, every shifting patch of darkness. The temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath formed visible clouds in the FIRELIG dot at 9:15. The first rock struck. It wasn't thrown directly at us. Instead, it crashed through the branches about 20 feet behind my tent, sending a shower of pine needles to the ground. Kyle jumped up, flashlight in hand, but the beam revealed nothing but still trees and empty space. "Probably just fell from somewhere," he said, but his voice had lost its usual certainty. Before I could respond, another rock landed, this time to our left, closer to the camp's edge, then another from a different direction entirely. "That's Not random, I whispered, grabbing my own light. The rocks weren't large enough to cause serious harm, but their placement felt deliberate, a perimeter being marked, a warning being issued. We heard it then, movement in the brush, circling our campsite. Whatever it was made no attempt at stealth, pushing through the undergrowth with slow, measured steps. The sound would stop, then resume from a different position, always just beyond where our lights could reach. "Hey!" Kyle shouted, his patience finally breaking. "This isn't funny." His voice echoed through the trees, met only by that same purposeful movement, now completing another circuit around us. Hours passed this way. Every time we thought it had stopped, another rock would land, or branches would crack under heavy steps, or that musky odor from the dome structure would drift past on the breeze. Our fire burned low, and neither of us dared move far enough from its light to gather more wood. "We should never have gone to that structure," Kyle said around midnight, his earlier skepticism crumbling. "We're not welcome here anymore. If we ever were." I nodded, remembering how the birds had gone quiet that first day, how the forest itself seemed to hold its breath when we approached the woven dome. "Think about it," I said. "If something's been living here, watching this territory, and we just walked in with cameras and drones." "Stop," Kyle cut me off. "Just stop. I don't want to theorize right now." Another rock landed, emphasizing his point. This one struck closer than the others, sending sparks flying as it rolled through the edge of our fire. The message was clear: we were being tolerated. For now, but only barely. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. Neither of us slept, sitting back to back as the harassment continued with methodical patience. The movement never ceased entirely, and twice more I caught glimpses of something massive shifting between trees, just at the edge of perception. Each time, it vanished before I could focus properly, leaving only swaying branches and that lingering wild scent. As the sky finally began to lighten, the rocks stopped. The circling movement withdrew, but the tension between Kyle and me had grown into something tangible. We'd crossed a line by investigating that structure, and now we were paying the price for our curiosity. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, I pulled out my camera with trembling hands. The night's ordeal had left me exhausted, but I couldn't shake the urgent need to document everything before we left. Kyle watched me with growing frustration as I photographed the scattered rocks, measuring their distances from our camp and noting their positions in my field journal. "What are you doing?" he demanded, already stuffing his sleeping bag into its compression sack. "We need to get out of here, Aaron, now." "Just give me 15 minutes, I pleaded, switching to my DSLR's video mode to pan across the disturbed ground around our campsite. "Look at these impressions in the soil. Whatever was circling us last night left traces. We can't just walk away from this." Kyle threw down his pack with a thud. "That's exactly what we can do. That's exactly what we should do." His voice cracked slightly. "I've spent enough time in the backcountry to know when we're not wanted. This isn't about elk anymore. This isn't even about your photography." I knew he was right, but I couldn't stop. My hands moved mechanically from camera to journal, documenting everything I could. "Think about what we've seen, Kyle. The structure, the tracks, the coordinated movements. If we leave now without proof," he laughed bitterly. "Proof of what?" "Blurry drone footage and some rocks thrown in the dark." "You're starting to sound obsessed, and it's going to get us both killed." His words hit home, forcing me to pause. I looked down at my shaking hands, realizing I hadn't slept in over 24 hours. The memory of those heavy footsteps circling our camp played on repeat in my mind, along with the image of that dark shape moving through the trees. I had come here for simple wildlife photography, but now— "You're right," Kyle continued, softer now. "Something's out here. Something that doesn't want us here. But you need to prove it isn't worth our lives." I closed my journal slowly, feeling the weight of his words. I've spent years having people doubt my wildlife observations, the things I've seen in these mountains. If I could just— This isn't about validation, Kyle cut in. This is about survival. Whatever's out there gave us a warning last night. Next time might not be just rocks. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest felt deceptively peaceful now, but we both knew better. After a long moment, I nodded. Okay, I conceded. But we can't hike out now. We're both exhausted, and these ridges are too steep to navigate safely when we're this tired. Let's pack up camp and move to that clearing we saw yesterday. Better visibility, closer to the trail out. We'll leave first thing tomorrow morning. Kyle considered this, checking his watch. Fine, but we move camp now, and no more documentation, no more drones, no more investigating. He paused, then added quietly, I've lost friends in these mountains. To regular accidents, whatever this is, it's not worth it. I agreed, though it pained me to stop recording. As we began breaking down our camp, I couldn't help but notice how the forest had gone quiet again. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of our own movements and the whisper of wind through the pines. Something was still watching, waiting to see what we would do next. We worked quickly and efficiently, our years of outdoor experience showing in our practiced movements. But every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us freeze and scan the tree line. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against us, making even simple tasks feel dangerous. Despite Kyle's protests, I couldn't resist one final drone flight to document our hasty retreat. Just a quick sweep, I assured him, hands already working. The controller, 5 minutes tops. We should know if anything's following us. The DJI Phantom rose smoothly into the morning air, its white frame stark against the dark pines. I guided it in a wide arc, keeping the camera focused on the ridge we'd just descended. The monitor showed nothing unusual at first, just endless green canopy and morning shadows stretching across the drainage. Kyle paced behind me, checking his watch every few seconds. This is a mistake, he muttered. We need to keep moving. I was about to bring the drone back when something caught my eye on the screen. A disturbance in the trees, perhaps 200 yards back along our path. I tilted the camera, trying to get a better angle. The impact came without warning. Through the monitor, I saw a dark object, what looked like a thick branch or small log spinning end over end toward the drone. The trajectory was perfect, too perfect to be random. Before I could react, it struck the Phantom's body with devastating precision. The screen went wild, spinning as the drone plummeted. I heard the sickening crunch of plastic and carbon fiber meeting branches, followed by a final thud as it hit the forest floor. Jesus Christ, Kyle breathed. His face had gone pale. That couldn't have been an accident? I finished, still staring at the now dark screen. No, whatever's out there, it just took out a drone flying at least 60 feet up. It waited until we were vulnerable, until we were distracted. And then, Kyle grabbed my arm hard. This isn't about territory anymore, Aaron. This isn't about us disturbing its space. That thing is hunting us. Actually hunting us. The deliberate nature of the attack hit me then. The creature hadn't just reacted to the drone, it had calculated its movement, anticipated its path, and struck with deadly accuracy. This wasn't the behavior of an animal protecting its territory. This was something else entirely. We need to move, Kyle said, already shouldering his pack. Now, no more stops. No more documentation. That thing knows exactly where we are, and it's not just watching anymore. It's acting. I nodded, unable to argue. The lost drone and its footage seemed insignificant now compared to the growing certainty that we had crossed some invisible line. Whatever intelligence lurked in these woods had just demonstrated both its capability and its intent. We moved as quickly as we dared through the dense forest, our boots crunching on fallen pine needles. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, creating a premature twilight that set my nerves on edge. About 15 minutes into our retreat, I heard it, heavy footfalls keeping pace with us through the timber to our left. "You hear that?" I whispered to Kyle, who nodded grimly without breaking stride. That the footsteps matched our rhythm, but stayed just out of sight, maybe 50 yards into the trees. Whenever we slowed to check our bearings, the movement would pause too. When we resumed walking, so did our unseen escort. A sharp crack echoed through the forest, a branch snapping under significant weight. It came from our right this time, suggesting we weren't dealing with just one follower. Kyle grabbed my arm, pointing to a fallen log ahead. We needed to rest, but the growing darkness made every minute precious. "They're hurting us," Kyle muttered, as we took quick sips from our water bottles. "Notice how they keep redirecting us whenever we drift too far east." He was right. Twice we'd tried to angle toward an easier descent, and each time, loud wood knocks had prompted us to adjust our course. The sounds were deliberate, almost like a language. 2 quick strikes meant we'd strayed too far, while single knocks seemed to approve our direction. The daylight was fading far too quickly, shadows lengthening at an alarming rate. Our pursuers maintained their parallel track, neither closing distance nor falling behind. The message was clear. They were shepherding us out of their territory, and they would decide the route. After 3 grueling days of being herded through the wilderness, Kyle and I finally stumbled onto the gravel road leading to the ranger station. Our clothes were torn, our supplies nearly depleted, and our nerves completely shot. The wooden building, with its Forest Service logo and American flag, looked like salvation itself. The ranger, a weathered man in his 50s, listened to our account with practiced patience. His eyes never left his notepad as I described the dome-like structure, the tracks, and the coordinated knocking that had guided our retreat through the forest. "Bears are territorial this time of year," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "Especially with the berry crop being low. They'll sometimes shadow hikers to ensure they're leaving their territory." "Bears don't throw rocks," Kyle interjected, his voice hoarse. "They don't make structures out of saplings." I pulled out my laptop, hands still shaking slightly, and showed the ranger what remained of my drone footage. The dark shape moving through the trees, the brief glimpses of something massive and upright, but the images were grainy, distant, inconclusive. "I'll file this," the ranger said, copying the video files onto a USB drive. "But officially, this goes down as wildlife interference with recreational hikers. Probably brown bears defending a food source. The final report, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request months later, listed our encounter as possible ursine territorial behavior complicated by exhaustion and low visibility conditions. My drone footage was mentioned only as inconclusive digital media showing large wildlife movement. They kept the files, though. That's what stays with me. They kept every second of that footage, even while dismissing it publicly. Kyle and I parted ways in the ranger station parking lot, the gravel crunching under our boots as we walked to our separate vehicles. The handshake we exchanged was brief, almost mechanical, a far cry from the easy camaraderie we'd shared at the start of our trip. I watched his truck disappear down the Forest Service road, knowing something fundamental had shifted between us. Over the next few weeks, I tried calling Kyle several times. Each conversation grew shorter, more clipped. "I'm not interested in reliving it," he'd say, "or some things are better left alone." Eventually, he stopped picking up altogether. His silence spoke volumes about how deeply the experience had affected him. I spent countless hours reviewing what remained of the drone footage, frame by frame. The damaged memory card yielded little beyond what we'd already seen, but I couldn't stop studying that blurred shape moving through the trees. The image of the nest-like structure haunted me, its deliberate weaving, the careful placement of each sapling. No bear or storm could have created something so purposeful. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself mapping our route on topographic charts, marking the locations of each encounter. The pattern suggests intelligence, territory, and intent. We weren't just stumbling through random animal encounters. We were being systematically pushed out of somewhere we weren't supposed to be. The wilderness holds secrets that perhaps aren't meant for our understanding. There are places in those remote valleys and ridges where the modern world's certainties dissolve, where something ancient and aware still moves through the shadows. Our curiosity, our drones, our cameras, they're intrusions into a realm that demands respect rather than investigation. I've learned to be content with questions that may never have answers. Some mysteries of the forest should remain just that. Mysteries. If this story lingered with you, subscribe. I'll return tomorrow with more.